Hi. Today what we're going to focus on in our understanding, our developing understanding of English for specific purposes is how to carry out a needs analysis. Now, your textbook does a good job of providing some definitions and talking about some issues and then giving you some examples, some things to think about. What I want to share with you is far more personal, and it comes from my own experience of carrying out needs analysis and guiding developing teachers with learning how to do it. So I have developed a document. You've got it in Canvas, and it says carrying out a needs analysis. So what I would like you to do is to have this printed out and to use it as a graphic organizer to take notes on my lecture. So stop right here if you haven't printed it out and start back up when you're ready. Okay, I'll assume anyone listening from this point on has their graphic organizer ready, and basically what I'm going to do is hopefully breathe some life into it, make it real to you, and help you understand how the different parts hang together. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. So what I've written on it is step 1, start with the people involved. And I think that is not only chronologically makes sense to come first, but I think also in a meaningful way. English for specific purposes is about helping people reach real goals that they have for themselves. It's about helping employers help their employees reach real goals that they have. It's for customers or clients or guests or patients, whoever is receiving the communication in English from your students. It's helping them also to reach their own goals for success in the situation. And so you have to start out with the people involved. And notice that I've got 3 categories there. I've got employers, the customers or clients, and then last but not least, I've got the employees or the students. So if you were teaching, if you were hired by a big hotel in Beijing to teach English for the front desk people, then you would be talking with the managers at the hotel, maybe even the owners, as close to the owners as you can get. Any of the managers who directly supervise the front desk staff. So whatever group that needs to be to represent employers, that's who you would be talking with. You would also be talking with typical clients or customers at the hotel. So you might, for example, spend an afternoon in the lobby asking clients, English-speaking clients, if you can talk to them about what their needs are in English, or if they've had any problems, any things that they feel like they couldn't really clearly express to those who are working there. Anything that they notice that the employees were able to do well with English to meet their needs. Any problems or issues that they see from their perspective. And then finally, talking with the employees, the students, finding out what those who are going to enroll in your course or who are potential students, what is it that they want to be able to do with English? What are their goals? What are the issues that they notice? So one thing that I suggest that you do, especially if you're teaching ESP to those who already have a job in the field, I suggest that in addition to asking them what their goals are for using English and how they think they need to use English, I would suggest that you ask them to write out a list of what their job responsibilities are. Or if this is already available through the employer, that you do that. The reason is not that people reshape the truth or whatever about what they do, but I think that often people don't recognize all of what they do, or they don't even realize how much they do and how English might be involved in each piece. So I would suggest supplementing that information that you get from employees with a list of job responsibilities for them. In carrying out a needs analysis, there are a couple of different ways you can go. You can do brief interviews, which is what I typically do, or you can do surveys. And I think there's great reasons to do both. An interview can be, it can respond to whatever you see in front of you. So for you, if you, for example, are sitting in a hotel lobby and you watch a couple go up to the front desk and obviously they're getting checked in, you could stop them right away and say, you know, how was it? Did it work? Were there any things that you said in English that the front desk person couldn't understand? Were there any things that you wanted to express but you were worried that they wouldn't understand, that kind of thing? So if you do an interview, it's very flexible. It can respond to what needs to happen, and no one needs to read or write anything. And people might be more willing to answer questions that way. A survey, you don't have to actually be there. You could, for example, leave a stack of them at the front desk and ask permission to that any English-speaking guests, if they wouldn't mind filling out a survey, and it wouldn't even have to be you that was asking that it happen. And so there's a couple of different ways you can go there, either way, but both of them are grounded, very important, with starting with who are the stakeholders in this course. Who are the stakeholders who have something to benefit from students doing well in the course that you design and you offer? Okay, so where do we go after that, after we've collected information about the people involved? Next, we take a look at the situations in which English could or is being used. And on the sheet that I've created for you, I've got 6 situations. It's completely random. I don't know how many situations your students will be using English in, and it might be different for every single group that you ever work with. But what I've got there randomly is I've got 6 situations. And notice at the top of each one, the first thing that you need to consider is this reading and writing, or is this listening, speaking? So first of all, starting which of the 4 skills? And again, the 4 skills are reading, writing, listening, speaking. And we tend in our field to say them in exactly that order. So you start there, and then I'm asking you to think about what is being accomplished in each situation. So is a very typical situation for housekeepers at a hotel, for example, that people are asking for things that they need: extra towels, extra soap, a shower cap, those kinds of things. And so if you were working with hotel housekeepers, situation number 1 might be guests asking for things, and probably that would be listening, speaking. And so you would basically be trying to capture what's being accomplished with language in that situation. And anything else that you can capture about it. Is it principally questions or statements being made to the housekeepers? And what kind of answer do they need to give? Can it be a brief yes, no, or here you go, or you're welcome? Or does it need to be an explanation of how the shower works? So as much as you can with the different situations in which English is actually being used, capturing what you can about it at this stage. Now, how do you get that information about how English is used? You know, when you're talking with the employers, the customers, the clients, the employees who will be your students, you're probably already starting to gather that information. But I would suggest you also need to, as much as possible, see it firsthand yourself. Because just as I mentioned, that employees might undersell what they need from English, all the different ways that they might need to have access to English. It's very possible that English is being used in ways that the employees aren't even recognizing, or maybe the employers don't even know that these kinds of issues are coming up. So I highly suggest that you get to the environment yourself and you see how it works. Now let's say that you're hired in a city to offer an English for hotel staff program, a class, then I would suggest if there's maybe 4 or 5 hotels and they're all offering this program for their employees, I would suggest that you try, if possible, to get out to all 5. You might see some very important differences. For example, maybe one of the hotels is basically a hostel. It is a place where backpackers for $2 for a hammock can basically have a safe place to put their stuff and sleep in a big room with lots of other people. And one of the hotels might be a high-end hotel that only those with the most resources can afford to spend. It's very likely that the kinds of requests and questions that are coming up are quite different. At the high-end hotel, maybe the front desk folks are being asked, where's the best place to catch a taxi? And maybe at the hostel, the front desk staff is being asked, where's the cheapest place to eat? Or if I hitchhike to the next city, where am I most likely to get picked up? That kind of thing. So I suggest that you put as much time and as much effort as you can afford into finding out what are these key situations, okay? And once you've got that, once you know what people have to say and you have a sense of those situations, then we're ready to move on to the next step. So the next step is to begin to analyze the language that's being used. And we'll spend some time on this today in the needs analysis, but then I'm going to support you as well with the next lecture specifically about analyzing language. But to kick it off today and to make sure that we've all got a general sense, the place that I suggest that you begin, not because it's the best place, but because it's the easiest, is to begin to notice the vocabulary. So if you're working, for example, with taxi drivers, to begin to create lists of vocabulary that taxi drivers need. So this is not general English. This is not everybody's basic foundational English. This is what is the English that's needed by taxi drivers. And it might be in this specific city, right? So it might be that there are many, many statues in the city that these taxi drivers are working in, and statue is a key word that they need, whereas another city, there's none. Or if there are, there's certainly not anything that tourists would see. And so, so to start to pay attention to that, as you're developing your vocabulary kind of groupings, I would suggest that you begin to, as much as you can, put them into true groups. And so this is why working electronically is great, because you can keep changing them as you think through them. So for example, I would suggest putting verbs together and maybe nouns. But after a while, you might notice, hey, some of these verbs are two-part verbs, like take up or take off or pick up, that kind of thing. And so you might end up with 2 lists of verbs, those that are one word, which is typical, like take, and those that are 2-word verbs, like take up or pick up. And so I would suggest that as you are developing these vocabulary, that you keep adding to and refining and breaking up into smaller pieces. And one of the reasons that you're breaking them into groups is you're really truly seeing how does English work for taxi drivers. And as you're developing these lists, as you're breaking them into smaller and smaller groups, you will start to see what some of those patterns are with vocabulary. Okay, so as I mentioned, vocabulary is the easiest way to begin to kind of ease into your analysis of language. And what happens next? Basically what's going to happen next is I'm asking you to think about the different situations in terms of communicative competence. If you took second language acquisition either this past fall or the fall before, you have a good sense of what communicative competence means. To support you with that, I'm going to kind of give a really quick definition again and walk you through that. I also have placed a link about communicative competence on our module in Canvas, so that if you need a refresher, you just need to remember again, or you haven't taken second language acquisition before. So this is a new concept for you. This will kind of catch you up to speed. So when we think about what it means to use language well, Del Himes threw out the idea that the key is not to use language perfectly, but to use language well enough, right? Just to use it well enough. And then he pulled that apart. What does it mean to use language well enough? Well, the first thing that we do when we use language well enough is whatever it is that we're expressing to someone, whether we're apologizing, whether we're requesting something, whether we're explaining something, whether we're writing a formal letter, whatever it is, there is, within a culture and a cultural use of a language, there is a sense of what the beginning looks like, what the middle looks like, and what the end looks like. And that's called discourse competence. Sometimes it's also called rhetorical competence. They mean the same thing, but I tend to use the word discourse. And so discourse competence is looking at, if I'm going to apologize for something, what do I say first? And what do I say after that? And how do I end it, right? And part of it is politeness, but a lot of it is just what are other people expecting to hear? What can they count on from me? An example is if you write an email to your professor and you ask for a really big favor, like, could you take the final exam the day before? Or could you take the final exam the next day? So in a university instructor's world, that is a really huge deal. And it causes us to kind of rethink how we give finals. If you were to ask that, there is, at least from your instructor's standpoint, there is definitely a way I would expect it to begin, what I would expect the middle to say, and then probably how it would end. First of all, I would expect a pretty formal and very, very almost overly polite beginning. Dear Professor, or Dear Dr. Petrie, or Dear Doctor, or whatever. Not, hey, right? And another thing I would expect is not that you would simply make the request, but immediately or even before, you would give a very clear explanation of why it is that you're asking for this thing. So essentially the excuse, like someone in my family is quite sick, I've been asked by my parents to come home early to make sure I get to say goodbye, and that's why I'm asking. And I can go home and come back and take it a day later, or if it would be possible, I could take it the day before. So, and I would also expect that the email would end pretty formally too. Not see you around, but rather thank you for considering, or thank you for even considering this idea, or considering making the exception, sincerely, and then your name, that kind of thing. So that all is a long explanation of discourse competence. If someone uses language well, and here we're talking about language well in a specific context, that means whenever they express something in writing or in speaking, they know what the beginning should look like, they know what the middle should look like, and they know how to end it. Okay, so that is discourse competence. So you, as you go back to those 6 situations, again, it's random, it might be far more or far less than 6 situations that your students are using English in. But when you go back to those situations, it's really key to take a look at, for the interactions that happen, whether it's at the front desk, it's in the taxi, or whatever, how do they begin? What does the middle look like? How do they end? Right? So starting to pay attention to what are those pieces. And one thing that we tend to do a lot with discourse competence is we are so traditional. We so use the same language over and over again. We use something called functional language. So, for example, if you were to begin a letter to someone, you'd probably say dear plus their name, I am writing to, and then you'd say what the purpose is, right? I am writing to is functional language. So is dear so-and-so. It's something you can almost pull out of your toolbox and use over and over again, and people expect you to. Finishing your email or your letter with sincerely is another one. Or please contact me if you have any questions. We have read that or said that or written that so many times in our lives. And so that is functional language. So when you're examining for each one of these contexts, how each interaction begins, what the middle looks like, what the end looks like, be on the lookout for that functional language and how that supports it. Another thing that we look at when we talk about using language well enough is we look at how polite we are. And really, I don't mean as if like being super polite is the correct answer all the time and being impolite is the wrong answer. It's rather a little more complicated. It's being polite enough. If you think about it, when you joke around with your closest friends or your closest relatives who you've known either from birth or since you were younger, much younger, you probably are a little biting with each other, a little direct with each other at times. And it's not that you're being impolite, you are being the right level of politeness with each other that's expected for that particular relationship and that particular context. And so one of the things that you need to pay attention to for each of these situations you're analyzing in which your students are using language is, how does politeness show up, right? How formal or informal is the interaction, and how is that captured? For example, is it expected and is it appropriate for the employee to say sir or madam? Or is it more informal than that? And so that kind of language doesn't need to be used. Is it informal enough that some slang can be used? Or is it formal enough that almost academic vocabulary should be used? So one of the things you'll want to look at is, how does politeness show up? Another aspect of politeness is how direct are requests or demands. So for example, if a housekeeper needs to explain to a guest how to do something, what's the appropriate level of politeness to use with those directions? And so that is a very, very key part of analyzing those situations. So just to recap, so far we've talked about discourse competence, the beginning, middle, and end, and how those hang together, and then the appropriate level of politeness, which has with it formality, directness, things like that. The next thing that you'll want to look at is you'll want to look at grammatical competence. Now, when we say grammatical competence, we don't just mean grammar, even though it's called that. We also mean, besides grammar, how grammar is used, how is vocabulary used as well. And we've already talked about functional language with discourse competence. Functional language shows up here as well, so you can address it here as well as with discourse competence. Another aspect that shows up with grammatical competence is pronunciation. So when you think about grammatical competence, think about it like it's really small building blocks that students use or users of English use to piece together to make a message. Now, there's bigger pieces that matter even more, like politeness and discourse, that kind of thing, but these little pieces matter too. So when I ask you to look at grammatical competence, I'm asking you to look at the very specifics, and you'll be asking yourself questions like, what are the tenses that are used? Is the entire conversation in present tense? Is past tense needed? If so, why? And how does it show up? How is it used? You'll also want to look at, are there some vocabulary items in this situation that they are consistently going to be needed? I mean, you couldn't talk about this thing without using this word, and it's a difficult word for most people from this language to pronounce. Does this call for some extra pronunciation assistance? And so now we've got, as you analyze each situation, as you go back to it, we've got discourse competence, we've got social linguistic competence, and we've got grammatical competence, okay? And the last is strategic competence. How can employees fix communication breakdowns when they occur? And what about the context that they're in could they use to help fix those? So for example, if you were teaching a class that's for housekeepers at a hotel, and you follow around some housekeepers as they move their cart down the hallways, moving from room to room, you will probably notice that occasionally the guests, stop to talk to them, to ask for something. Well, if you have a cart full of towels and shampoo and other items, then the chances are that if the guest asks you for something and you can't tell what it is that they were asking for, you could hold up an item and say, this, for example. That is a strategy. And it may sound like cheating, it may sound like sidestepping the use of English, but if you think about it differently, it's using English well enough, right? It's having something to draw on, having another way of making meaning with a guest so that they can get what it is that they need, whether that's shampoo or a towel or a bath mat, whatever it is. And that is a key piece of preparing people to use English in the workplace. So once again, after you've got those situations, after you've determined what those situations are in which your students are going to use English, then you start to analyze the language closely. I suggest that you begin with vocabulary, not because it's a perfect place to begin, but because it's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's easier for us. It's a nice stepping stone, a way to begin to notice how words are used. And then once you do that, for each situation, notice those 4 competencies and how English is needed to accomplish each of those. So as we move on, I'm moving on to step 4 now. Now we're going back to who the students are, but we're going back in a different way. We're not looking at them in terms of having specific goals for the class, but rather who are they as students? And I have this broken up into 3 different pieces. Students' previous educational backgrounds, so how much formal schooling do they have already? Let me tell you about a situation that I assisted in Granada, Nicaragua, working with students who were all employees in tourism. Many of them were from hotels, and many of those from hotels were housekeepers. I would say that most of the housekeepers had at most a 3rd grade education, even though they were adults. And so that really impacted the way we approached the course with them. Their reading skills in Spanish were shaky. And so I used very few things written down at all. We did mostly listening, speaking, and that matched up too with what the students needed to do in their work. They didn't need to read English or write English. They simply needed to respond to the oral requests that they got from guests. So you'll want to think about how much educational background do the students have formally, and then you want to kind of build a pathway from that. If you are hired to teach at a university and you're teaching engineering students, they've already gone through high school, they're already maybe halfway through college, they are very formally educated. You could support what they're doing with lots of text, lots of reading and writing, and they will be very familiar with written homework, for example. And so you could draw upon that, and that would really impact how you design the course, how you design homework, how you design the activities. The second thing that I have there for you to pay attention to with your students are their learning preferences and their motivation. Finding out, especially one by one, finding out what motivates them. And there's lots of ways you can find this out. You could do it on the first day of class through a survey, through some questions you put up on the board and you ask them to respond to orally or in writing. But finding out, how do they like to learn? and especially if they are on the job, what would be meaningful to them. Now, everyone I've worked with who's actually already employed in the field that they're learning about, what they really want is they want activities in the class to look exactly like they're going to encounter when they walk outside of the room. And so I wouldn't be surprised that is something that's expressed again and again for you. So find out how they want to learn, find out what motivates them. And finally, what you need to do is to determine what's the gap between the English the students can use now and the English that they need to be successful in those situations that you've seen they need to use in their jobs, in their professions. And it can look like lots of different things. It can look like following them around and seeing how they respond directly. It could look like a language assessment that you're giving them. If when walking around and observing your students, your future students, using English or encountering guests in the hallway, if all of those interactions are listening, speaking, really there's not much reason to find out what they can do in reading and writing in terms of English. So narrow whatever assessment you do so it's really focused on finding out what they can do. And one of the things that you may find relevant is pronunciation. And so when I talk next time about how to analyze language, I will teach you how to diagnose pronunciation issues, at least how to get started with doing that. But pronunciation for some contexts may be a big deal that you're spending a lot of time on, and in other contexts it's not relevant at all. Okay, so step 4 was noticing the factors that are going to impact these particular learners in your classroom. And it might be quite different every time you teach the course. All right, step 5. Step 5 is somewhat similar. It's noticing the factors that you'll be teaching in. So it's not the students, it's the classroom environment. Where will you be teaching? And what's the schedule? And how will that benefit and how will that challenge your instruction? I have 2 factors there for you to think about: space and location of the classroom, and then scheduling patterns. So the where and the when and how often. Let me tell you about a situation that I assisted with teaching in, and it had both benefits and challenges. So in Granada, Nicaragua, as I mentioned, I assisted with a class for those working in tourism, and they were all either restaurant employees or hotel employees. And one of the hotel owners actually gave up a conference room in her hotel so that we could teach the class in it. Now, a benefit of that was we were right there. And what I've seen in research shows that the closer you can bring your classroom to the actual work environment, it increases motivation so much. Even if you're not bringing in those outside pieces, even if you're not bringing in a hotel guest to kind of be a guest speaker that day or whatever, just being at the location can be quite motivating. So that was a great benefit for us. On the downside, it was noisy. It was in a hotel. We held the class during breakfast time, and so people were getting up and using the hallways and getting their breakfast, and so it was quite noisy. So that was that was a bit of a challenge. But if you think about it, if you are training employees, if you are educating employees to work in a hotel environment that's noisy, it's not such a bad idea to have a noisy classroom, right? Because then they don't have as big of a challenge moving from theory of your classroom to the actual thing, because they've already started to deal with situations like a noisy environment to try to hear English in. Scheduling patterns. If you meet every day for an hour, that can be a benefit. You're seeing students a little bit each time. You're hopefully not losing their motivation over that hour. On the other hand, you can't do a whole lot in an hour. You would find that you just get into a topic, you just start a role play, and then there's not time for the second role play that you had created. So, so as you think through the challenges that the context of the classroom have for you, that will be important as you start to think through how to plan the class and how to respond to those challenges. Step 6 that I have here for you, suggesting for your needs analysis process, is to go ahead and create that initial plan. So what would a course plan look like? It would look like the what of teaching, right? So you would have identified what are those contexts in which, what are those situations in which English needs to be used. You would label those. For example, in a hotel, one of the situations that might come up again and again is a customer, a guest, expressing that there's a problem. What is the problem? So you might have part of your course devoted entirely to customers expressing problems, and then how can an employee respond well to that? How can an employee meet the expectations of the guest and do it in a polite way that's using expected language, all of those competencies, that kind of thing. And then you would be, and you don't know what these are yet, but you would be building in those pedagogies, those strategies that best practices seem to point us to, and my own experience reinforces for me in ESP, really, really work. And so step 6 is the what does this all mean kind of thing. And this is where you would begin to develop a syllabus. Okay. So I know that was a whirlwind trip through how to create and how to carry out a needs analysis. And for us in this course, we of course won't be able to carry out a full needs analysis, but we'll be able to try out some different pieces of it, especially the language analysis piece. But some final thoughts about needs analysis. First of all, it is the key piece of teaching English for specific purposes. And as I've mentioned before, it probably is the key piece that separates general English teaching from teaching English for specific purposes. Every choice you make in your course needs to be devoted, come out of not your instinct about what needs to happen, but rather what your needs analysis points to what needs to happen. So I wanted to highlight that. There's another piece too. I think that you're probably getting a sense from this that needs analysis is something that you do before you plan a class. It happens before, or it happens in those early days of a class. I want to reinforce another idea. If you're doing needs analysis well, it's something that happens before you teach the class, it happens during the class, and it's happening afterwards. And then you close the loop. Maybe you carry out a full needs analysis, you design the course, and 2 times during the course, you are going out to employers and finding out, do they see any differences? You could share with them, we've been working on these things. Do you see any differences in your employees in terms of how they use English around these topics? Or what do you see me not addressing at this point that I need to reinforce in the class? So that's the during. And then the after. After the course has ended, even after the final assessment, going back out and following those employees, maybe a few weeks, a few months into their work, and finding out, what do they still need to know? What did they learn that was most of benefit to them? What have they used? What didn't they get from the course that they need? Then you close the loop and you redesign the course based on what you hear from them, so that the new group coming in, or one of the new groups coming in, they get a different course, and it's been changed by the experience that you captured in the needs analysis. So, needs analysis, it's key to this profession. Being comfortable with carrying one out, knowing how to carry one out, knowing what to do with what you find out, that is key for English for specific purposes. And then hold yourself accountable for carrying out a needs analysis before, during, and then after you teach the course. And keep making it better, and keep making sure that it's focused on the needs of the students right in front of you. Not last year's students, not students you remember in the past, but these students, because their needs may be a little bit different this time. Okay, good luck with your needs analysis and exploring the materials we have online and the activities. I'll see you in the discussion.